The Cold War did not begin with an explosion, a battlefield charge, or a declaration read aloud to the world. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in offices, safe rooms, coded cables, and whispered assessments written late at night by men who never appeared in history books. While the world expected another world war with tanks and armies, something else replaced soldiers as the primary weapon. Information did, and those who controlled information became more powerful than generals. This is where the real Cold War started, not on borders, but inside minds. After World War II ended, the world was exhausted, but not at peace. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as two superpowers with completely opposite systems, values, and fears. Both sides believed the other posed an existential threat, but another global war would mean nuclear destruction, something neither side could survive. So they searched for another way to fight without triggering apocalypse. The answer was intelligence. Spies replaced soldiers, secrets replaced bullets, and silence replaced explosions. As an intelligence analyst looking back with decades of declassified material, the first thing to understand is this: the Cold War was never truly cold. It was constant pressure, constant suspicion, and constant planning for worst-case scenarios. Every move by one side was interpreted as a possible prelude to disaster. This made intelligence agencies the first line of defense. If you could predict the enemy's intentions, you could avoid catastrophe. If you failed, the world could end. The CIA and the KGB were not born as mirror images, but they evolved into rivals with one shared obsession: control of reality through information. The CIA was created in 1947 to prevent another intelligence failure like Pearl Harbor. Its mission sounded simple on paper: collect information, analyze threats, and advise leadership. In practice, it became something far more complex, operating in legal gray zones, foreign capitals, and hidden networks. The KGB, formally established in 1954, but rooted in earlier Soviet security organs, had a different mindset. It was not just an intelligence service. It was also an internal security force, a counterintelligence machine, and a political enforcer. Its job was to protect the Soviet state from enemies abroad and dissent at home. To the KGB, information was not only about understanding the enemy, it was about controlling society. From the very beginning, both agencies understood one brutal truth: whoever saw first, acted first. This turned the entire planet into an invisible battlefield. Europe became ground zero. Asia, Africa, and Latin America became testing grounds. Neutral countries became hunting zones for influence, assets, and leverage. No place was truly neutral, only temporarily ignored. Berlin symbolized this new war better than any city on Earth. A divided city inside a divided country, filled with diplomats, soldiers, journalists, and refugees. In intelligence terms, Berlin was an open-air laboratory. CIA officers and KGB operatives lived blocks apart, watched each other, followed each other, and recruited from the same pool of desperate, ambitious, or ideologically driven individuals. Every cafe conversation could be an intelligence lead. Every friendship could be a cover. What the public rarely understood was that most intelligence work was not glamorous. It was paperwork, surveillance logs, financial tracking, and endless cross-checking. The myth of the lone spy saving the world is powerful, but the reality was teams of analysts trying to interpret fragments. A rumor here, a photo there, a coded message intercepted but not fully understood. The danger was not lack of data, but misinterpretation. Fear drove decisions on both sides. The United States feared a sudden Soviet military strike. The Soviet Union feared encirclement, infiltration, and ideological collapse. Intelligence agencies became the eyes and ears that leadership depended on. This gave them enormous influence. A single report could shift policy, increase military spending, or justify covert action. One of the most important shifts of the Cold War was the move from reactive intelligence to proactive intelligence. Instead of simply observing, agencies began shaping events. This included influencing elections, supporting friendly groups, undermining hostile governments, and spreading narratives favorable to their side. Information was no longer just collected. It was deployed. This is where the line between intelligence and covert action blurred. The CIA developed specialized units focused on political warfare, psychological operations, and influence campaigns. The KGB refined techniques of disinformation, using controlled media, planted stories, and trusted intermediaries. Both sides understood that perception could be more powerful than reality. If people believed something was true, it became functionally true. Another critical development was the professionalization of espionage tradecraft. Dead drops, coded language, surveillance detection routes, and compartmentalization became standard. These were not tricks from movies. They were survival techniques. One mistake could expose an entire network. Intelligence officers learned to live double lives, hiding their true purpose even from close friends. Recruitment became the heart of the war. Both agencies searched for individuals with access, motivation, and vulnerability. Ideology mattered, but so did money, ego, resentment, and fear. Contrary to popular belief, most spies were not fanatics. They were ordinary people making extraordinary choices under pressure. This human factor made intelligence both powerful and unpredictable. At the same time, counterintelligence became ruthless. Catching the enemy's spies was as important as running your own. The KGB invested heavily in internal surveillance, assuming infiltration was inevitable. The CIA developed defensive techniques to protect sources and identify penetration. The result was a constant chess match, with moves hidden from public view. The nuclear dimension added urgency to everything. Missiles could be launched in minutes. Early warning systems were imperfect. False alarms happened. In this environment, intelligence assessments could prevent disaster or trigger panic. Analysts were trained to remain cautious, but political pressure was intense. Leaders wanted certainty in a world that offered none. One of the least understood aspects of the Cold War is how often intelligence failures were quietly corrected before becoming public crises. Near misses occurred. Misread signals were reinterpreted just in time. These moments never made headlines because success in intelligence often looks like nothing happened. The world survived and nobody noticed. The invisible battlefield extended into science and technology. Both sides raced to steal or replicate advances in weapons, communications, and computing. Technical intelligence became just as important as human sources. Satellites, signals interception, and later cyber capabilities transformed espionage from a human-only craft into a hybrid system of machines and analysts. As an intelligence professional reviewing this era, one conclusion becomes clear. The Cold War did not stay cold by accident. It stayed cold because intelligence agencies absorbed the shock, filtered the fear, and provided just enough clarity to avoid catastrophe. This does not mean they were always right. They were often wrong, but the system, flawed as it was, prevented the worst outcomes. Spies replaced soldiers because soldiers would have ended the world. Intelligence offered a way to compete without annihilation. It was slower, messier, and morally ambiguous, but it worked. The battlefield was invisible, but the consequences were real. Governments rose and fell. Alliances shifted. Lives were destroyed or saved in silence. By the end of this phase of the Cold War, one truth had been firmly established. Power no longer belonged only to those with armies. It belonged to those who understood information, perception, and timing. The CIA and the KGB were not just agencies. They were instruments of state survival in an age where open war was impossible. And this was only the beginning. As techniques matured and stakes increased, The war in the shadows grew deeper, more personal, and more dangerous. Trust would become the rarest resource, betrayal the most effective weapon, and the quiet war would move from observation to manipulation, setting the stage for everything that followed. If Part 1 explained why spies replaced soldiers, Part 2 explains how they actually fought. This was the mechanics of the Cold War. Not speeches, not summits, not public threats, but the daily routines of deception that ran beneath normal life. This is where the war became personal, where trust was weaponized and identity itself became a tool. The first reality that must be understood is that espionage depends on communication that cannot be traced. Intelligence without secure delivery is useless. This is why dead drops became one of the most critical techniques of the Cold War. A dead drop was not dramatic. It was deliberately boring. A hollow brick, a park bench, a trash can, a loose tile, a tree knot. The goal was to look so ordinary that no one would ever notice. From an intelligence perspective, dead drops reduced risk. Two operatives did not need to meet. No conversation. No physical connection. One left information. Another retrieved it later. Surveillance teams could follow one person, but not both. This method saved countless networks from exposure. It was simple, reliable, and extremely difficult to prove in court or diplomacy. The CIA and the KGB refined dead drop procedures to the point of obsession. Timing windows were precise. Signals were subtle. A chalk mark on a wall, a piece of tape on a lamppost, a specific object placed incorrectly. These signals meant one thing to civilians and another to trained eyes. This was not paranoia. It was survival. Surveillance detection routes became an art form. Operatives never traveled directly from home to a drop. They took indirect paths, changed transportation, entered stores, exited through different doors, and observed reflections. This behavior was not cinematic flair. It was how agents confirmed whether they were being followed. One missed detail could end a career or a life. But dead drops and signals were only tools. The real weapons were people. Human intelligence sources were the backbone of the Cold War. Both sides invested enormous resources into recruitment. Analysts identified targets with access to military plans, political discussions, scientific research, or internal debates. Then case officers studied their psychology. Contrary to popular myths, ideology alone rarely motivated spies. Most were recruited through a combination of factors: money, ego, resentment, fear, compromise, or personal grievance. Intelligence agencies understood that human weakness was universal. A disgruntled official, a marginalized scientist, a pressured diplomat. These were opportunities. Once recruited, a source entered a world of constant pressure. They lived two lives, one public, one secret. They lied daily to colleagues, friends, and family. The stress was extreme. Many later described paranoia, insomnia, and isolation. Intelligence agencies knew this and used it carefully. A broken source was a liability. This environment produced one of the most dangerous figures of the Cold War, the double agent. A double agent claimed loyalty to one side while secretly working for the other. In some cases, they truly defected. In others, they were controlled from the beginning. In intelligence terms, a double agent could be more valuable than 10 normal sources. Double agents distorted reality. They fed selected truths mixed with lies. They confirmed expectations. They reinforced biases. Decision makers trusted them because they appeared reliable. This is where deception reached its highest level. Entire strategies were built on information that was technically plausible but strategically false. The CIA and KGB both believed they could control double agents. Both were often wrong. In many cases, intelligence services thought they were running an asset when they were actually being manipulated. This produced cascading failures. Bad intelligence led to bad policy. And because sources were secret, mistakes were slow to correct. One of the most uncomfortable truths revealed by declassified material is how often intelligence agencies deceive their own leadership unintentionally. Analysts worked with incomplete data. Political pressure influenced interpretation. Worst-case assumptions were rewarded more than caution. In this environment, deception did not always come from the enemy. Information itself became the deadliest weapon. A single document could reveal missile locations, defense gaps, or internal debates. But raw information was rarely decisive on its own. What mattered was timing and context. Releasing intelligence too early could expose sources. Too late, and it became irrelevant. This led to the rise of compartmentalization. No one knew everything. Sources knew only their handler. Handlers knew only their region. Analysts knew only fragments. This protected networks, but created blind spots. Sometimes critical connections were missed because no single person had the full picture. The KGB emphasized control and discipline. Its internal security functions meant that fear played a larger role. Defection was considered betrayal, not just of the state, but of ideology. Punishments were severe. This created loyalty, but also encouraged silence. Some threats were never reported because reporting itself was dangerous. The CIA emphasized flexibility and decentralization. Case officers were given more autonomy. This allowed creativity, but increased risk. Not all operations were approved at the highest levels. Some succeeded brilliantly. Others failed quietly. The institutional memory of failures was often incomplete. Disinformation campaigns expanded beyond intelligence circles into public discourse. False documents, planted news stories, and manipulated narratives were used to shape opinion. These operations did not require full belief. They only needed doubt. Confusion weakened unity. Division created opportunity. One key lesson from this era is that intelligence agencies learned to think in probabilities, not certainties. Absolute truth was rare. Instead, analysts assessed likelihoods. This created friction with political leaders who wanted clear answers. Intelligence was blamed when predictions failed, even when warnings were nuanced. The Cold War produced a permanent state of suspicion. Every defector was questioned. Every source was tested. Loyalty was never assumed. This environment prevented some disasters, but destroyed trust. Internal investigations consumed resources. Careers ended on suspicion alone. Technology began to change deception. Signals intelligence allowed agencies to intercept communications, but encryption improved. This created an arms race between codemakers and codebreakers. Each breakthrough was temporary. Each success created new vulnerabilities. Despite public narratives of omnipotent intelligence agencies, the reality was constant uncertainty. Success depended on judgment under pressure. Mistakes were inevitable. What mattered was whether systems corrected them before consequences escalated. As an intelligence professional examining this period, the conclusion is uncomfortable but clear. The Cold War did not reward truth. It rewarded believability. Information that aligned with expectations traveled faster than contradictory evidence. This made deception easier and correction harder. Dead drops, double agents, and deception were not isolated tactics. They were an ecosystem. Each reinforced the other. Together, they allowed a global conflict to unfold beneath ordinary life without triggering open war. This was not clean. It was not heroic. It was necessary. By the time these methods matured, intelligence agencies were no longer just observing history. They were shaping it. And as manipulation replaced observation, the line between defense and control blurred further. The next phase of the Cold War would push this system into cities, societies, and entire populations. The war was no longer just about secrets. It was about influence. And that shift would change everything. By the time deception became routine, the Cold War moved fully into cities. Not battlefields, not borders, but urban spaces where ordinary life provided perfect cover. Cities allowed spies to disappear in crowds, hide in bureaucracy, and operate under diplomatic protection. From an intelligence perspective, cities were not just locations, they were systems. Transportation, housing, media, embassies, and human density all worked together to support espionage. Berlin was the most important of these cities. Divided physically and psychologically, it offered unmatched access. Intelligence agencies treated Berlin as a live training ground. Operatives learned surveillance, recruitment, and counterintelligence in real time. The presence of multiple intelligence services created constant friction. Everyone assumed they were being watched. Often, they were. In Berlin, embassies functioned as intelligence hubs. Diplomatic immunity provided protection, but also limitations. Known intelligence officers were monitored constantly. This forced agencies to innovate. Non-official cover officers operated without diplomatic protection, blending into business, journalism, or academia. If exposed, they had no safety net. Washington and Moscow were different, but equally critical. These were power centers where policy was made. Access mattered more than geography. Intelligence work here focused on influence, long-term recruitment, and policy insight. A single well-placed source could be more valuable than an entire network elsewhere. The CIA developed a style often described as quiet manipulation. Influence was exerted subtly. Academic exchanges, cultural programs, economic cooperation, and advisory roles created access points. The goal was not immediate results, but gradual alignment. Intelligence officers measured success in years, not days. The KGB focused on precision and control. Its operations emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and centralized approval. This reduced improvisation, but increased reliability. Assets were tightly managed. Deviations were discouraged. This approach limited creativity, but minimized exposure. Safe houses became essential infrastructure. These were ordinary apartments or offices used for meetings, storage, and rest. Their locations changed regularly. Patterns were avoided. Even trusted sources were not brought to the same location twice, if possible. Predictability was treated as vulnerability. Surveillance became institutionalized. Teams followed targets in shifts. Observation posts operated from apartments, vehicles, or public spaces. Surveillance was not just about watching. It was about understanding behavior. Routines revealed stress points. Changes signaled risk. One of the most revealing aspects of urban espionage was how much effort went into avoiding detection rather than gathering information. Staying hidden was more important than acting quickly. Intelligence agencies accepted missed opportunities to protect long-term assets. Many Cold War operations never became public because they achieved limited local objectives, preventing a policy shift, delaying a decision, creating uncertainty. These outcomes did not produce headlines, but they influenced trajectories. Intelligence impact was often cumulative rather than dramatic. Counterintelligence intensified in cities. The KGB assumed constant infiltration and built systems to detect anomalies. The CIA trained officers to assume compromise as a possibility. Internal reviews, loyalty checks, and behavioral analysis became standard. This atmosphere eroded trust even within agencies. Urban espionage also relied heavily on social engineering. Casual conversations, professional networking, and shared interests created access. Relationships were cultivated patiently. Recruitment often followed years of contact. Sudden approaches were considered high risk. Disinformation expanded into local media and intellectual circles. Articles, conferences, and publications were used to shape debate. The goal was not to convince everyone, but to normalize certain narratives. Once ideas entered mainstream discussion, they gained legitimacy regardless of origin. Technological surveillance increased the scale of monitoring. Telephone interception, mail opening, and later electronic monitoring allowed agencies to collect vast amounts of data. This created new problems. Analysis lagged behind collection. Signals were lost in noise. Intelligence failures in cities often resulted from overconfidence. Familiarity bred complacency. Long-term operations created emotional investment. Officers trusted sources who had been reliable for years. When compromise occurred, damage was extensive. Another overlooked reality is how intelligence activity affected civilian life indirectly. Increased security, suspicion, and secrecy shaped urban culture. People adapted behaviors without knowing why. The Cold War influenced daily routines in subtle ways. As intelligence agencies expanded urban operations, they also learned limits. Total control was impossible. Cities were too complex. Human behavior was too unpredictable. This forced agencies to prioritize. Not every threat could be monitored. Not every lead pursued. The distinction between intelligence collection and political influence blurred further. Cities were where opinions formed. Universities, unions, and professional organizations became contested spaces. Influence operations targeted thought leaders rather than masses. By the late Cold War, intelligence agencies understood that cities were not just operational environments. They were strategic assets. Controlling narratives, access, and perception within cities shaped national behavior without visible force. From an analytical standpoint, this phase marked a shift. Espionage moved from individual secrets to societal influence. The objective expanded from knowing what the enemy planned to shaping what populations believed. This transition increased ethical ambiguity. Intelligence officers were no longer just observers or protectors. They were participants in social engineering. The long-term consequences were uncertain, but the immediate benefits were clear. Cities of shadows became permanent features of global politics. Even after tensions eased, intelligence infrastructure remained. Habits persisted. Systems adapted rather than disappeared. By the end of this phase, the Cold War had fully embedded itself into civilian life. The war was no longer hidden beneath society. It operated through it. And the final question emerged naturally from this reality. If fear, influence, and perception could control nations without a single shot, then what did victory even mean? By the final phase of the Cold War, one fact had become undeniable inside intelligence circles. Power no longer came only from weapons or armies. It came from fear, perception, and control of narrative. Nations could be influenced, restrained, or redirected without invasion. This realization changed how victory was defined. The question was no longer who could destroy the other, but who could shape reality without being seen. Fear became the most effective instrument. Not panic, but sustained uncertainty. Intelligence agencies learned that populations and leaders behave cautiously when outcomes are unclear. Ambiguity slowed decisions. Doubt fractured unity. This allowed strategic advantages without open confrontation. The Cold War functioned because fear was managed, not released. The CIA and the KGB both contributed to this system. Neither side fully controlled it. Intelligence assessments influenced policy, but policy also pressured intelligence. Leaders demanded reassurance and warning at the same time. This contradiction placed analysts in an impossible position. They were expected to predict the future without provoking it. One of the most important revelations from declassified records is how often intelligence prevented escalation quietly. Warnings were delivered privately. Signals were interpreted carefully. Back channels were used to clarify intentions. These actions rarely became public because acknowledging them would expose vulnerability. Stability depended on secrecy. At the same time, intelligence agencies exaggerated threats unintentionally. Worst-case thinking dominated analysis. This was not dishonesty. It was structural bias. Analysts were punished for missing threats. not for overstating them. This sustained high tension, even during periods of relative calm. Public narratives simplified the Cold War into ideological victory or defeat. Inside intelligence communities, the view was different. There was no single winning moment. The Soviet system weakened gradually under economic pressure, internal inefficiencies, and loss of confidence. Intelligence agencies observed these trends, but they did not create them alone. The CIA did not collapse the Soviet Union. The KGB did not save it. Intelligence influenced outcomes at the margins. It accelerated some processes and slowed others. The final result emerged from a combination of internal and external forces. This challenges popular myths. Victory was not clean or decisive. It was incomplete and fragile. The Cold War ended without a formal surrender because it was never a traditional war. Its end was administrative, political, and psychological. Another uncomfortable truth is that intelligence agencies survived the Cold War by redefining threats. Once one enemy disappeared, others emerged. This was not conspiracy. It was institutional momentum. Systems built for constant vigilance do not shut down easily. The legacy of Cold War espionage persists today. Tradecraft evolved into digital surveillance. Influence operations moved online. Disinformation scaled globally. The principles remain the same. Control attention. Shape perception. Exploit division. From an intelligence perspective, the Cold War taught that absolute secrecy is impossible. Information leaks eventually. What matters is managing exposure. Damage control became as important as prevention. The ethical cost of this system is still debated. Intelligence operations undermined democratic processes abroad. Civil liberties were compromised at home. These actions were justified as necessary at the time. History has not reached a final verdict. Fear, once normalized, becomes difficult to remove. Societies conditioned to suspicion struggle with trust. This is one of the deepest consequences of the Cold War. The war ended, but the mindset remained. So who really won? The honest answer is that no intelligence agency won completely. Nuclear war was avoided. That alone was a victory for humanity. But the methods used left lasting scars. The CIA proved that influence and flexibility could project power globally. The KGB proved that control and discipline could maintain a system for decades. Both demonstrated the limits of intelligence. Neither could engineer a perfect outcome. The Cold War ended, but the spy war did not. It transformed. Intelligence agencies adapted to new technologies, new adversaries, and new arenas. The shadows shifted, but they did not disappear. The most important lesson revealed by history is this: when soldiers step back, spies step forward. When open conflict becomes impossible, hidden conflict becomes inevitable. Intelligence does not prevent conflict. It changes its shape. This story was never about heroes or villains. It was about systems operating under extreme risk. People made decisions with incomplete information and permanent consequences. The Cold War was won not by conquest, but by endurance, by managing fear without unleashing it, by competing without destroying everything. And that is the final truth intelligence history exposes. The world survived not because spies were perfect, but because they were careful enough.